A country where 95% of your oil comes from one source, where your biggest industries survive on preferential deals with a single neighbor, where your very survival as a nation depends on the goodwill of one man in the Kremlin. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is Belarus in 2025. When Alexander Lukashenko called Vladimir Putin during the 2020 protests, desperately asking for military support, he wasn't just making a phone call. He was acknowledging a brutal reality that most Belarusians refuse to accept. Their country has painted itself into a corner so tight that losing Russia's support would mean economic collapse within months. But how did Europe's last dictatorship become so dependent on its eastern neighbor? And what would happen if Putin suddenly decided Lukashenko was no longer useful? The answers reveal a web of economic dependencies so complex that Belarus has essentially mortgaged its sovereignty for survival. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Belarus, under the iron grip of Alexander Lukashenko, has relied on Russia to keep the wheels turning. And we're not just talking about diplomacy. We're talking about gas, oil, trade, weapons, and political backing that has allowed Lukashenko to stay in power for over 3 decades. Why does Russia support Belarus so much? Because Belarus is more than a neighbor. It's a buffer state, a critical piece on the geopolitical chessboard between Russia and NATO. Let's start with the most obvious chain binding Belarus to Russia: energy. Belarus produces virtually no oil or natural gas of its own. Yet it's built an entire economic model around being Russia's energy middleman. Here's where it gets fascinating and terrifying for Belarus. Russia doesn't just sell oil to Belarus, it practically gives it away. While European countries pay market prices for Russian crude, Belarus receives it at roughly 30% below market value. In 2023, this discount amounted to approximately $2.8 billion in savings, money that represents nearly 5% of Belarus's entire GDP. But here's the catch. Belarus doesn't just use this cheap oil for domestic consumption. The country has built 2 massive refineries that process Russian crude and export refined petroleum products to Europe. These refineries employ over 30,000 people directly and support hundreds of thousands more jobs in related industries. The numbers are staggering. Belarus exports about $3.5 billion worth of refined petroleum products annually, making it the country's second largest export after potash. Now let's talk about Belarus's crown jewel, potash. Belarus sits on some of the world's largest potash deposits, and Belaruskali, the state-owned mining company, is one of the world's largest potash producers. You might think this gives Belarus independence. After all, the fertilizer is literally dug from Belarusian soil. Think again. Russia controls Belarus's potash industries in ways that would make any economist's head spin. First, there's the infrastructure trap. Most of Belarus's potash exports flow through Russian ports, particularly through the Baltic terminals controlled by Russian companies. When Belarus tried to diversify its export routes through Ukrainian ports in 2013, Russia simply restricted rail access and imposed technical inspections that delayed shipments for weeks. The 2021 sanctions following the forced landing of the Ryanair flight revealed just how dependent Belarus had become. When European ports stopped accepting Belarusian potash, the country lost access to 60% of its traditional markets overnight. Russia stepped in as the White Knight, offering to buy Belarusian potash at guaranteed prices and helping to redirect exports through Russian channels to Asian markets. But this rescue came with strings attached. Belarus had to accept Russian involvement in pricing decisions and agree to coordinate production quotas with Russian potash producers. Belarus's military is essentially a Russian satellite force. The country spends less than 1% of its GDP on defense, relying instead on Russian security guarantees and military integration. Belarus hosts Russian military bases, uses Russian weapon systems, and depends on Russian training for its officer corps. In 2022, Belarus allowed Russian forces to stage their invasion of Ukraine from its territory, cementing its role as Moscow's launch pad. Over 30,000 Russian troops were stationed in Belarus, and tactical nuclear weapons followed in 2023. Why does this matter? Belarus borders 3 NATO countries, making it Russia's western shield. Losing Belarus would expose Russia's heartland to NATO's reach. For Minsk, Russian protection is equally critical. Lukashenko's regime, weakened by protest and Western sanctions, relies on Russian backing to deter internal and external threats. In 2020, when protests erupted after a rigged election, Putin pledged security support, signaling to the West that Belarus was non-negotiable. Could Belarus go it alone? Unlikely. Its army, with just 15,000 combat-ready troops, can't match NATO's might or Russia's firepower. Without Moscow, Belarus would be vulnerable, caught between a hostile West and a resentful Russia. For now, the Union State's iron grip ensures Belarus stays in line. Perhaps nowhere is Belarus's dependency more evident than in its financial system. The Belarusian ruble is essentially a shadow currency, with its value determined by the country's ability to earn Russian rubles and US dollars from exports to Russia. Belarus's banking system is intertwined with Russian banks in ways that would make separation extremely painful. Russian banks hold significant stakes in several major Belarusian banks, and cross-border lending between the two countries exceeds $8 billion. Belarus uses Russian payment systems for international transactions, and many Belarusian companies maintain their primary accounts in Russian banks. If Russia were to cut off banking ties, Belarus would face immediate liquidity problems that could trigger a financial crisis within days. Here's something most analyses miss. Belarus's social stability depends on Russian labor markets. Over 300,000 Belarusians work in Russia legally, sending home remittances worth approximately $1.2 billion annually. This isn't just about money, it's about political stability. These migrant workers serve as a pressure valve for Belarus's economy. When unemployment rises in Belarus, people can move to Russia for work. When political tensions increase, dissatisfied citizens can emigrate eastward. Russia's common labor market with Belarus provides opportunities that simply don't exist elsewhere for most Belarusians. The European Union, Belarus's obvious alternative partner, has imposed sanctions that make meaningful economic integration impossible. Even before the 2020 protests, EU-Belarus trade was limited by political tensions and incompatible economic systems. Belarus's state-dominated economy doesn't fit well with EU market requirements. The harsh truth is that Belarus's economy is designed around Russian integration. Changing this would require rebuilding the entire economic system, a process that would take decades and cause enormous short-term pain. So what happens if Belarus loses Russia? Economic collapse would come first. Without Russian energy subsidies, Belarus's refineries would shut down, eliminating the country's second-largest export industry. Potash exports would face massive logistical challenges without Russian transit routes. The currency would collapse as export revenues disappear. Social unrest would follow quickly. Unemployment would spike as industries dependent on Russian markets shut down. The government would lose its ability to maintain social services and public sector employment. Popular anger would focus on a government that had led the country into a dead end. Belarus's story is ultimately about the tension between sovereignty and survival. Lukashenko has spent decades trying to maintain independence while accepting dependency. He's built a system that preserves the symbols of statehood while surrendering the substance of sovereignty. The tragic irony is that Belarus's attempts to maintain independence from Russia have only deepened its dependence. By refusing political integration, Belarus has been forced to accept economic integration on increasingly unfavorable terms. The country maintains its flag and anthem, while Russia controls its economic lifeline. As the world watches Ukraine, Belarus's quiet struggle unfolds. It's a reminder that in geopolitics, some nations don't choose their allies, they're chosen for them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.